You are listening to the Go Get Them show. This is a discussion that inspires entrepreneurs to pursue their passion to create meaningful, impactful, and sustainable companies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is your host, Arun Krishnakumar, together with my co-hosts, Maxon T. and Sheila Mburu. We sit down with entrepreneurs, operators, and investors across frontier markets to discover their experiences, lessons learned, and how they make an impact so you can too.
Markets, extension, communications with farmers, and how the Gates Foundation program linked to.
And like I said, the truth is, there's a single story about Africa.
So hi everyone, and you're listening to the Go Get 'Em podcast. We are speaking to people who are creating impact across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I'm your host, Sheila Mburu, and I'm joined by my co-host, Arun Krishnakumar. And today we'll be joined by Arlene Mitchell, who is doing some exciting work across the agriculture and nutrition space. So Arlene Mitchell is the Executive Director of the Global Child Nutrition Foundation, which works with a range of stakeholders to ensure that children across the world have nutritious and locally sourced school meals. Arlene was previously the Deputy Director for Agricultural Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we're really excited to hear more about that. And previously also an executive at the UN World Food Programme, where she led the school feeding programme. Arlene also serves across a number of boards of organisations working in international food, agriculture and nutrition. And we'll be hearing more about her work in the sector and the impact that she's made over her career. So just to start with, welcome Arlene. We're really happy to have you join. As you know, I have a background in nutrition, so particularly interested to hear about the work that you've been doing across Africa, Asia and Latin America. But to start with, it would be great to hear more about the work that you were doing previously at the Gates Foundation in agriculture before we move into finding out what you're doing now. So over to you, Arlene. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Nice to be with you today. My work at the Gates Foundation was in the agricultural sector, in the agricultural development team. But it spanned a whole variety of activities. So basically, it was about markets, extension, communications with farmers, and how the Gates Foundation program linked to the national programs, the government programs, et cetera. So we did quite a bit of work on establishing strong relationships with targeted countries, so that our work would be understood by and supported by the government. We knew that the Gates Foundation alone couldn't make the kind of changes and sustain them that need to happen. So that was particularly exciting work because the Gates Foundation had not done a great deal of engaging with governments prior to that, particularly in agriculture. So that was very exciting. But at the outset, my work kind of carried over from the work I had done at the World Food Programme. We had been very involved in school feeding programs, school meal programs for decades in the World Food Programme. And toward the end of my assignment in WFP, the World Food Programme, we had started to look at how school meal programs could be sourced from local farmers, an approach we called homegrown school feeding, so that you weren't just feeding children at school, but you were investing in the local economy, you were encouraging smallholder farmers to actually produce for the school meal program. And that spun off into a number of activities which the Gates Foundation funded, including a very large program called Purchase for Progress, which basically supported the World Food Programme to scale up all of its purchasing options, not just for school meal programs, but purchasing foods in low income and lower middle income countries, to start purchasing food where they could from smallholder farmers so that they were investing in local economies and agricultural development as well as feeding people in that country. So it was extremely exciting work. And as I said, it carried over from my UN experience with the World Food Program into the Gates Foundation. And it continues since I've left the Gates Foundation. Both the World Food Program and some other partners and my current organization, all involved in homegrown school feeding. And in this whole bringing the health and nutrition, the education, the agriculture, and the economic development sectors together in one program called Homegrown School Feeding. And those are basically the pillars of development. So it's particularly exciting to not just kind of get this concept going in the World Food Program, but to carry it into the Gates Foundation. And now mostly we work primarily with governments to try to get them excited about the opportunity to invest in their own agriculture as they implement school meal programs as well.
Thanks for that, Arlene. Amazing story on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation experience. I just have something for you in terms of understanding your work that you do as the executive director at Global Child Nutrition Foundation. I often, when I speak to people working with foundations, so I have some friends in India focusing on, for instance, financial inclusion for women, right? And they often say it's hard to kind of focus on one single problem when you're addressing these social issues. They're all very interconnected. So, and it's not like you're in a technology sense, you focus on a piece of code, write that, and solve that, and it is done. You have to think through it more holistically and understand the interrelationships and try to solve it in a holistic sense. So why is food and nutrition still a problem across the world? And why are we facing still, I mean, the world's GDP keeps increasing and we still find challenges where child nutrition is still an issue. Why is that the case? And what does your organization, Global Child Nutrition Foundation, what is it doing to address it? And how are you doing it?
Well, you kind of asked two questions. I'm going to separate them a little bit here. On the agricultural side, it's really a conundrum about agricultural development having floundered so seriously, I feel. We had the Green Revolution. Things really were exciting, and there was huge investments, mostly in staple crops, maize, wheat, rice, and more recently soy. And those crops got all of the attention. And the Green Revolution resulted in an increase of calories and a reduction in hunger. And I believe the world thought they had kind of solved the problem, right? They also thought that what worked in India would work in Africa, or what worked in Asia would work in Latin America. And that didn't translate. It didn't work. So one of the things that happened was that calories became more available. There was still a lot of hunger in the world, but calories became more available. But nutrition didn't become available. So nutrition became more expensive. And the nutrition community talks about the double burden of hunger or nutrition, of malnutrition, the triple burden of malnutrition. And I would say there's actually a quadruple burden of malnutrition. So first you have undernutrition, people not getting enough to eat in particularly poverty-stricken areas. You have a huge and growing problem of obesity, overweight, which isn't necessarily because you have the right nutrition, but you have too many calories, basically, and a sedentary life, and calories from the wrong sources. The third thing is the lack of micronutrients. Specific micronutrient deficiencies are causing huge problems for nutrition and health. And I would add the fourth issue is the economy of nutrition. The cost of nutrition is extremely high. If you're looking for protein sources, they're expensive. If you're looking for fresh fruits, vegetables, healthy foods, they're more expensive and they're often perishable. And in addition, back to the agricultural equation, there hasn't been the same investment in legumes, in fresh fruits and vegetables that there has been in maize, wheat, and rice and soy. So you have this imbalance, and then you combine that with issues around private sector development and food processing and tastes and behavior change issues, et cetera. You find a private sector that responds to a desire for sugar, fat, and salt, which are very tasty. So they develop foods for that market. And again, you're neglecting the micronutrients, the fresh and healthier foods, and the perishable foods get left out. So you have this kind of collision of interests in these four areas that causes an ongoing, very serious challenge.
Really fascinating hearing about the quadruple burden. I think I'm familiar with kind of the double burden of nutrition, but I think laying it out in that way is, it's really impactful to kind of understand the challenges. I'm kind of interested to hear more about the impact of the quadruple burden on the social and economic development of these countries, and just to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, nutrition interacts with everything that we are and do, right? So there's huge evidence and great, relatively recent, but great agreement and investment in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. From the minute a woman gets pregnant to a child's being 2 years old. That time frame it took decades, but nutritionists now agree that those first 1,000 days are the most important time for nutrition to have a long-term impact on a person's life. We all agree with that. First 1,000 days, hugely important. My concern is what happens after that first 1,000 days. If you do everything right, you invest everything right in the mother and her child, infant, and it turns 3, does that mean you stop being concerned about nutrition? Absolutely not. Both mental development and physical development continue through age roughly 21. And all of that process of brain development and psychological development and physical development have to be receiving attention all the way through to at least adulthood, the marker point of being 21. And that's not really been happening. There has been the first 1,000 days attention, and in some countries, not everywhere, the school meal program kind of picks up on a national scale to take care of school-age children, but there's still the gap of preschoolers. And there's a very serious problem at adolescents, particularly in low-income, lower middle income, and some middle-income countries. Girls drop out of school. And even if there is a school meal program for secondary school, and most countries don't have school meal programs at secondary level, even if there is one, girls tend to be dropping out by the time that program would kick in. So if an adolescent girl isn't educated and well-nourished and healthy, they don't become healthy parents. And there's a disconnect in some of our thinking about that being okay, right? It's just plain not okay that we're not taking care of children through their full development period. I believe in the life cycle approach. We should be worried about nutrition throughout everyone's life, but particularly this extremely vulnerable period from conception through adolescence to adulthood. And we need to combine that with education, because without education, you don't get sustainable change.
Yep, absolutely, Arlene, because I was talking to Water Foundation recently, and they're trying to serve certain parts of the world where women typically walk several miles a day to get water for their families and their farms. And by giving them access to water, they've solved the water problem, but they've given these women a lot more time, which meant they could actually use that more productively to increase their income, which meant kids were able to go to school, which meant that the GDP of that little village started getting better. So just with fixing the water problem, they were able to kind of fix so many other intricate problems in the society, which is quite amazing, which is fascinating. And often, at least from where I sit, I mean, when we look at problems, we look at it as a siloed problem. Often that is not the case. And just going back to the point that you mentioned, there are several organizations we work with, particularly in the agri-tech space, that are focused on solving some of the problems that you mentioned. So one firm, for instance, that we work with, they are solving, or rather, they're helping improve farmers' income, but also helping improve the fat content of the food that they create, or food products that they cultivate. How do these organizations typically get to access funds from these foundations? Is that a well published and well defined process? Is there enough centralization around it?
That's a very tough question to answer diplomatically. I've worked in government, I've worked in UN, I've worked in Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I now work in a small charitable nonprofit organization. So I've kind of seen this. I've also been in the private sector a little bit. I've seen this from a number of different angles. And I think there's some very, very basic flaws in how we approach development. But the problem is I don't have a clear answer for how to fix it, except I do think that things need to be they need to be more accessible, right? So the quick answer to your question is it's very hard to get funding from foundations. And it's based on a few things that I think don't relate to how well you might operate and what a difference you might make on the ground. It's about who you know. It's about having a slick and compelling story. It's about how well you write the proposal. It's about being big enough and have a proven track record that you can manage large amounts of money. And those don't necessarily translate into good programs. Yes, it's important that there be checks and balances and good money management, et cetera. But if you have to go through a KPMG or some other kind of audit at a very sophisticated level, it rules out large numbers of very effective smaller organizations. If you have to have a slick presentation, doesn't matter how well you know your community and speak your local language. If it isn't slick and in English, it doesn't have credibility. So there are these serious impediments, and I think all of the foundations are struggling with how to remove those. But just by the sheer amount of money and reputation at stake, it's extremely hard to find a way to work with smaller organizations, even if we know they might be more effective at getting the work done. it's also a matter of scale. So we used to have these huge debates in the Gates Foundation about, do we do one massive grant with some well-known donor and manage that, implementer and manage that grant, or do we do 50 little grants, and how are we going to manage those, right? Another problem that happens is people don't speak the truth to foundations because of the power and money that foundations represent. So you have to work very hard working in a foundation like Rockefeller, Gates, Ford, these big foundations. You have to work very hard to figure out if your idea is really the best thing since sliced bread, or if people are just telling you that because you represent Bill Gates and you represent millions of dollars and you represent this opportunity to change the world, right? And it's a huge impediment, and all of us who are on that side of the equation have a very hard time because it's so ego gratifying to think that your ideas are embraced by everyone you talk to, right? I must be really, really brilliant because everyone reacts positively to my idea. Well, my idea could be crap, but I'm representing a doorway to millions of dollars potentially, right? So it's all about this power thing. And power in development has really been the biggest impediment, I think. The donor world represents all of this power, and then sorting out the real truth and what will really work, and working with the people that really know what's needed and who trust each other. And trust is a huge issue in development that people rarely talk about. But if I come in as an American into Togo in Africa, and people don't trust me, nothing's going to happen with all of my program money, Bill Gates' name or whatever behind me. It really requires an ongoing level of trusting relationship. And we're too impatient in the richer country world. We want to see results immediately. We don't take that time to build the trust and the understanding and the honest relationship that really is required if our idea and our exchange of thoughts about what could work and make things better is really gonna take place and be sustainable. And in agriculture, that's particularly important. In nutrition, that's particularly important. It takes 12 years minimum before you could see the results of a really significant agricultural project. That's because of growing seasons. That's because you're going to have some years with more rain and some years with less rain. That's because it takes a while for the farmers to learn what's expected and how to do it and all of that. And most programs are 4 years, maximum 5 years long. And to get that ongoing trust and to give the program enough time to take hold is almost impossible in this donor recipient relationship that we have going on. So I think we need some significant changes in this whole equation of development. But it's going to be very hard to change just because of the way power dynamics go down and the way human behavior is. It's about ego. It's about money. It's about power, and finding a way to break through that, to build the trust and to build the understanding and to give the programs time to germinate and be successful is really tough equation.
Arlene, thanks for that. I just have one follow-up question on that, on what you just mentioned. You mentioned that some of the program or most of the programs are 4 to 5 years in length, and I often find that's very small. And I actually criticize the venture capital world for taking a short-term approach to business, because if you expect a business to return your money in 4 to 5 years, and especially social impact businesses to expect to give you returns in 4 to 5 years, that's harsh. You've got to give them at least 10 years. So if in that kind of a scenario where you've mandated with a particular, let's say, a country in Africa, you're looking to improve farmers' well-being by 10%, for instance, or farmers' income by 10%, how do you decide then, do I need to now extend the program, or do I need to find more help? How does that work from that point?
Well, I think it depends on the donor, whether it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the U.S. government, whomever. I think it makes quite a bit of difference who your funder is, how hard that decision-making process is. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa in the 70s, and a friend of mine, I didn't know him well, but he got involved in a forestry program where he was planting trees. And he went from being a Peace Corps volunteer planting trees to working at USAID, the International Agency for International Development, where he worked on forestry. And he did that for decades, I think 30 years. And he probably had more impact than anyone I know on forestry in West Africa. But what it took, it was just amazing. He could get $50,000 from here and $5,000 from there. And 1 minute it was USAID who was all into forestry. The next minute it was, the German government. And he had to just keep going and literally begging and piecing together for decades, right? But he worked with the same people in the same countries over that period of time, and it made a huge difference. They trusted him. Sooner or later, he was able to piece together that money to make it happen. I mean, it's just stunning what it took. But how many people have that kind of stick-to-itiveness to hang in there with it, to try every angle that you could possibly try? Yeah. Not many.
It's really interesting to hear from the foundation perspective, because obviously I work with UK government funders, and some of the issues are the same. So they have funding timelines which are up to 4 years.
Absolutely.
Traditionally, the agenda has been set by the northern countries. And so we're doing actually lots of work around building what we call equitable partnerships and thinking about how we can shift that balance and transfer some of that power back to low and middle income countries. And I'm interested to hear, you mentioned that the Gates Foundation, when you were there, did some kind of innovative work in terms of working with governments directly. And you mentioned that that's something that Gates weren't doing before. It'd be great to kind of, and you mentioned also actually that your organization now is working directly with governments. It'd be great to kind of hear what your experience has been, and, you know, have you been able to build that trust, and any tips that you have for anyone kind of thinking about how to build better relationships with national governments?
Yeah, I think it's tricky. Again, I think it's a long-term equation. You're not going to see, and this is a mistake many of us have made. Oh, I'm good friends with the president or the vice president or the minister or whomever, right? And so miracles are going to happen because we're in sync and we're going to make this all happen. But governments change, and they change really frequently. Our own government included, right? And it's not just that governments change. One of what I think is a flaw in the Gates Foundation is that they renew their strategies for agriculture, for health, or whatever too frequently, I think, because you barely have time to get the dialogue going and the grants in place, et cetera. And the strategy shifts, and those things are no longer in favor, right? And the same thing is happening on the other end of the equation. There's an election, or there's a civil strife or something, and the government changes. And so it can't be based on these. It can be triggered by and helped by these individual personality relationship efforts, but it can't be just that. It has to be, and this is one of the things I love about my current organization. It's only been active in this space since 1997, 98, but it's been consistent, and it's been with a pretty much the same countries. Although the portfolio expands, the core countries that started with us are still engaged with us. A lot of the same entities, our partners in World Food Program, our partners in London School of Economics, et cetera. All those partnerships sustain, and some of the same players come together every year, year in, year out, and communicate across timeframes and across borders, et cetera. And so again, it's this trust building, and it's not a personality, it's a family of relationships that sustains, right? And that builds trust, that builds a base of relationships, that if one party changes, you still have other people you can work with to keep things going. And I think that kind of relationship has happened in some fields and with some organizations, but it doesn't happen enough. And I think investing in some of that long-term and deep relationship building would be a wise move. But it's hard, as I said, it's hard to sustain because of the politics and because of normal systems changes, et cetera, that evolve.
Thanks, Arlene. One last question before we close the show, which is primarily around gender and inclusion or equality, right? I recently read a book called Invisible Women, and it's written by Carolyn Criado Perez, and the first 10 pages of the book itself kind of shows you how much men take the world for granted. You mentioned about us in the developed world taking the world for granted and a lot of things for granted. I think if that applies even to the gender differences. So you've been working a lot in the for girls' education, that space as well. What kind of gender biases have you seen on the ground? With a little bit of background coming from India, in a village in India, I see a little bit of that. I've seen child or babies, girl babies put to death, not firsthand, but I've heard of that. And there's quite a lot that's been done in India to kind of prevent that and bring that down. But what have you seen in your journeys in terms of the work that you've done, the changes in societies you've seen in the last few years or decades?
Well, I have seen changes. That's the good news, and toward the positive things. But it's also a huge disappointment to me. The whole space of gender. So I recall when I finished being a Peace Corps volunteer, I read a World Bank report. So it would have been somewhere in the late 70s that this report was written. And the bottom line of the report, it was an annual report. The key theme was that girls' education was the best investment you could make in development. And I kept that in mind, and I felt it as a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger. I worked a lot on gender issues. I saw a lot of challenges for gender. I was in fact on the receiving end of some gender bias issues and stereotypes, et cetera. Anyway, for 30, 40 years, I was really pounding the table about gender. And some things have improved, right? But it took us until roughly 2000 before, and the Education for All initiative, UN, and the Millennium Development Goals, et cetera, to really open the door to education for young girls, right? And now the data is, or at least pre-COVID, the data was pretty good about huge improvements in gender balance in schools until primary school, and then the girls drop out, as we were talking about earlier. And it took me a long time to come to the realization that the basic core problem for girls' education is economic. I don't believe it's religious. I don't believe it's cultural. I think it's sheer economics. The girls' value for working at home or working elsewhere to bring income to the family, or to be sold for marriage, or at least get her out of the family because she's a strain on the family's economy. Those things are the driving factors. I really believe that economics is the core thing. The second thing is safety. I wouldn't want to send my daughter to school if she had to walk 5 kilometers and all kinds of horrible things could happen to her along the way, coming and going. I literally visited a school in Ethiopia where girls were literally not sent to school because a man who raped a girl could consider her his wife from there on. So they literally ringed the schoolyard waiting for the girls to come in. So if they raped her, she was theirs, right? I would never, in Afghanistan, parents literally said, if it's more than 2 kilometers, we are not sending our daughter to school. Who can blame them? And then this issue of adolescent girls and hygienic support. I mean, how is it that there aren't private bathrooms for girls? Why don't they get support with menstrual supplies? Men don't have those expenses and those challenges, and so it furthers the imbalance, right? Then you have the issue of treatment. I asked a couple of little girls who hung out around my house when I was a Peace Corps volunteer why they didn't go to school, and the direct translation of what they said is because you eat shit at school, and that meant you got beaten at school, right? Who would go to a school voluntarily where you knew you were going to get a ruler across your knuckles if you got the answer wrong, right? And then the last piece is the lack of role models. We know that role models are really important. A girl needs to see that a woman can be president in order to envision herself as possibly being a president or a scientist or a mathematician and we don't give them those role models. We give them role models of models who are skinny and wear high heels and do their hair right. We don't give them models. We're beginning to, but there have been far too few role models of women doing really exciting scientific things, business successes, etc. So the best role model many of us have had are teachers, and teachers are underpaid, undervalued, very overworked, etc. But at least we have, in most cultures, we have teachers as a starting point, but it's not enough. It's really not enough.
Thank you so much for that, Arlene. Great insights all along. So, first of all, thanks for spending time with us. Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything else to say really. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you well with this series. It's really exciting.
Right. Thank you so much, Arlene. Yeah,
nice
lovely to meet you,
Sheila.
and great to hear about the amazing work you're doing in the sector.
Yeah, I'd love to stay connected.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's lots of learnings we could potentially share working different sides of the funding aisle, but in the development space. It'd be great to share some insights. Yeah.
Exactly. Great. Well, thank you both.
Thank you, Arlene.